So I've been listening to this podcast called History of the Great War podcast. Well, it's called History of the Great War. You can probably find it on Spotify. Well, you can definitely find it on Spotify and probably wherever you listen to your podcasts. It is a podcast about World War One, and I've listened to approximately about 100 episodes now. They're about 20 to 25 minutes each. I plan to listen to the whole thing before I move on to another podcast or Great Courses Plus, or now it's called Wonderium courses in history and spirituality. I kind of go through podcasts and lecture courses completely before I switch to another one because I'm constantly wanting to learn about history and spirituality, and to try to make myself someone who understands and who can just be a better person in general while I'm at work, because that's when I can listen to things. I mean, I can listen to things all the time, and I do, but at work it's very convenient. I happen to have a job where I can do that, luckily. But History of the Great War podcast, World War One, it's not something that the average person who knows a little bit of history knows about. We usually know about World War II. It feels closer. It feels more intimate. It's rare. It's rare that you'll find a person who doesn't know who sees the word Nazi and says Nazi. Though there were some people in high school that I went to high school with when you had to read out loud, they said Nazi, and that was very disappointing. But World War One is just not. It's not prevalent within either, at least the United States educational system, at least Texas's educational system, to any significant degree, nor public interest. But I would like to talk about one. So I've basically listened to there's about 14 parts to this one battle in World War One, the Battle of the Somme. And don't worry, I'm gonna spell out everything for you, because if I do it on camera, then I don't have an opportunity to correct myself. So I will be placing, the spelling of things correctly, in both the pictures that is in this video and the description below. So, Battle of the Somme. One side you had the British, and one side you had the Germans. Now, once again, well, I've said this in the past, I haven't said it in this video. I'm not a historian, but I'm trying to get to the human factor of this. If I get something wrong, please don't think that this is the main purpose of this podcast is to get all the numbers right. It's more about YouTube channel. It's to get the human element right, which is what I always try to do. If you've been watching me for a while, you know that the human element is the main element that I have on my channel. It's getting down to that and what to do specifically in spirituality and rituals, and what to understand specifically to what people experienced. So the Battle of the Somme, there were these battalions called PALS battalions, PALS, PALS battalions, from Britain. From the vast majority of the Somme battle, the Germans were on, the defense. There were counterattacks, very effective counterattacks, some counterattacks that were half-hearted, but in general, the Somme, the Germans were moving back. These PALS battalions, basically, if you and a lot of your friends, or you and your fellow factory workers, or you and everybody at your job, people that you knew, if you all joined up, young men, very young men between the ages of like 16 and 23, in that range, if you all joined up together, you could fight together. You wouldn't be separated. And one of the realities about World War One is that the idea of attrition, the idea of moving forward in lines, throwing men into an attack rather than using them tactically, but just trying to throw men in, like you might see in the 1800s and the 1700s, where lines of men with they didn't have muskets, they had bolt action in World War One, but just lines of men would just move forward. The idea of tactical use of infantry, it wasn't developed in the way that we see in wars later on, and definitely in World War Two. Especially on the British side in the Somme, you'd have not it wouldn't always be this way, but quite a few attacks on the Germans. You'd have British infantry, these PALS battalions, for instance, moving forward at a walk with their bolt-action rifles, just walking forward. Now, just to explain a little bit about the battlefields in World War One and the Somme as well, is that before an attack, the side that's defending, and your side as well, will put up lines and lines and lines and lines of barbed wire. Set up machine gun positions. And machine guns were the bread and butter of armies. Well, them and artillery were the bread and butter of armies in World War One. Because the average soldier had a bolt action rifle. Machine gun positions are the ones who did most of the killing, and artillery pieces are the ones that did most of the killing. The average infantryman, he might have 10 to 20 grenades, but the gun that he had was a bolt action rifle. So prior to a major advance, and a lot of these and major attacks could have up to 50,000 soldiers in them, more, less or more, depending on the situation. But division after division after division, and multiple divisions be part of a corps, and multiple regiments be part of a division, multiple battalions be part of a regiment, multiple companies be part of a regiment. So or a battalion, and multiple battalions be part of a regiment. But and basically a battalion usually would be 1,000 men, if I'm correct, and a company would be 100. And then lower than a company wasn't super relevant in World War One, because we're talking about very big groups of men moving forward. Squads, those weren't factored in until World War Two. Squads and platoons, which we're talking about below 100 men. But before an attack, there'd be shelling, artillery shelling, and for a really good shelling, there'd be one gun for every 10 yards of front that you're trying to shell. And in World War One, the shelling could last. It could literally keep on going for weeks at most, like round the clock for weeks. On the Russian front, the Russians weren't too good about concentrating artillery, having enough shells. But on the Somme, shelling went before the first major attack. I think that this shelling went for 5 days. That the British were shooting artillery shells at the Germans, at the German entrenchments for 5 days straight. They're not taking breaks. And an average shelling would at least be, would at least be for hours. Just smaller shelling things. But for a major attack where tens of thousands of men are being pushed forward, might shell for, 5 days in the case of the Somme. But this is why trenches were such a thing in World War One. Is that in order for you to survive such things, and there weren't really tanks until a little bit later in World War One, but they weren't super effective like they were in World War Two, which tanks could just go over trenches. But they didn't have that well, I don't know, I'm not sure we'll call it a luxury, but they didn't have that tactic. They didn't even when the British first made tanks, they didn't They didn't really know how to use them. It was a whole new thing. Um, but in the Battle of the Somme, uh, and we're talking about World War One was in very early 1900s, um, around 1914 and onward, maybe 1913. Once again, not a military history podcast or YouTube channel. Keep on saying podcast because I'm listening to that podcast and he says podcast all the time. But I'm trying to give you an idea of the battlefield. So many shells. Think of the effect that had on you. So you're in trenches, and you dig deep into the earth as well. So you have trenches where like it covers over your head, and then you have dugouts where you dig deeper and deeper into the earth. A lot of those dugouts, they didn't have shells that could go as deep as need be to actually get into the dugouts, but they could definitely get into the trenches. And then in some attacks, when the British kept on moving forward, they didn't have the luxury of trenches. They just had shell craters to hide in. Before they did another attack. And then that's when the counter artillery could really mess you up. So when you have all these shells exploding around you, body parts everywhere, bodies everywhere, the constant noise, not being able to sleep, sometimes for days, water and food not being able to get to the front on both sides. I'm talking about both sides in this instance. There's the most constant strain on the human mind, where you have little food, little water. You're running out of water. You're running out of food constantly, if you even have it. There's a lot of instances on the Somme where people ran out, like no water got to their positions for days. Sometimes there's a few instances, well, not even a few, more than a few, where food didn't even get to them within 5 days, 6 days. And there's a constant shelling. There's a constant sniper fire. There's the constant threat of enemies just randomly attacking in groups coming at you either way. This strain on the human mind is it just blows my conception away. And these PALS battalions, I getting back to my original points. And a lot of these areas used to be forests, used to be, villages or, fields. And after so much shelling for so long, they just look like the area around Mordor in Lord of the Rings. And that's actually where the author, Tolkien, he was in World War One. That's where he got the description for Mordor, is the World War One battlefield, the average one, where you have, and just to give you an idea of how many people were dying on the Somme battlefield, and even if it's 100 square miles, which it wasn't, it's much less than that, less than half of that. Around 400,000 men on the German and British side died within 40 square miles. That's 800,000 people. And 40 square miles is being generous. But I'm giving a liberal estimate because I don't want to make it as more dramatic than it sounds, and the reality is actually more dramatic. Sons, uncles, brothers, fathers, grandsons, great-grandfathers, all these men they always mattered to somebody. Somebody invested so much emotional love into these people, so much care into bringing them up, and then their lives are snatched away at a moment's notice. And some of these PALS battalions, the reason why they were, some of them actually just walked forward instead of like running or ducking for cover, is because there's this thing called the creeping barrage, where your artillery would try to bomb in front of you so that it keeps the enemy in their trenches, and it takes out the sentries that are keeping lookout for when the barrage stops and tells everybody to come out of the dugout. They're trying to keep the enemy down so that you have a better opportunity to kill them. So sometimes, a lot of the time, it would be at a walk because you want to stay behind the barrage, but then the barrage always goes further ahead. But then they were still taught to walk sometimes, and then that was the order, and they just walk forward. And in the History of the Great War podcast, one of the instances that really struck me was when there's a soldier that said he saw the whole front line. We're talking hundreds of men, hundreds. They all dropped down like almost immediately after they got out of their trench and started marching forward. And as he said, he was really confused at first. He's like, "Oh, we weren't ordered to like drop down and then fire," not knowing that a machine gun or machine gun placements had just hit the entire front row of hundreds of men, and they just fell, either wounded or dead. Machine guns could shoot out hundreds of rounds a minute. A bolt-action rifle is one shot at a time. Grenade is your best option. Artillery is your best. Machine guns are, well, I can't really say it's more of an enemy than artillery, but artillery and machine guns ruled the battlefield. And then for the guys that had the bolt-action rifles, it almost seems like it was, 1800s, 1700s, where it's just lines of people walking forward and then just getting hit by weapons that new tactics hadn't been made to counter. Just hundreds of men just dropping within the first 10 seconds of getting out of your trenches and going towards their trenches. Just dropping, either wounded or dead. For the PALS battalions, because they joined in groups and they all knew each other, you could join as groups and serve together. If they were sent into, a lot of them that were sent to the Somme, entire neighborhoods, entire towns, entire cities, their young men all died at once. A generation for a town gone within sometimes 10 to 20 seconds. All those boys that those mothers raised up, who had all these aspirations, hopes, and dreams, 10 seconds, hundreds of these people who had the same value as you and me, same value, dead, hundreds within 10 to 20 seconds. And we can't forget that. We have to remember this situation in different ways has happened before, but the human cost is the numbers are always remembered, but the human cost, making it real, thinking about these young people just dying immediately and the effect that it had on everyone else that they knew, that loved them. That's what we got to remember. And that's what's important. Because we have to remember that. Because if we don't, then their deaths almost made nothing. We have to remember, no matter what side, even you support in the World War One, World War Two, it's more black and white. World War One, a little bit less, but we got to remember what war is. If we don't, then it'll just happen again and again and again. At any rate, thank you very much for watching. Remember history, and all of you have a wonderful day.